Monty, I have a quick question for you. You know, over the past 6 or 8 years, we've been able to follow what's been going on in politics with regard to the internet, interactive development, and social media in order to get ideas for how to implement things for clients and businesses. You know, we've seen a lot of successes there, but can you talk about a few things that haven't worked as well, or that some things that have failed along the way?
Yeah, I think I'll focus on one actually, and I think we've been talking about hyper-localization versus having some broad-based social media and whatnot, and pinging off of a little bit of what Wolfgang said as well as what Steve said, in looking at what's the advantage of broader platforms like Open Social and Facebook that are kind of sitting on top of how people experience online versus much more niche type programs. I think we're seeing the same thing politically. A lot of people have tried to capitalize on creating small niche social networks in this political cycle, whether it's eAssembly, Y08.org. A lot of them have been created, and none of them have been successful. Most of the conversation has been happening on these broader platforms. And so really, whether you're talking about language and kind of breaking out things by language, or talking about memes and topics, I think it may work one way for language, but from a topical standpoint, I'm finding that the richer conversations are happening not on these specialized sub-forums, whether you're talking about just smaller issues, at least in politics. They're happening on Facebook itself. They're happening on these broader social networks. They're happening on Twitter, where you have a cross-section of people that are able to engage in the conversation from both sides, where you have things like hashtags, which allow you to be able to kind of drill down a little bit into individual conversations and track these threads. But it's really talking about the conversation that's sitting on top across these different platforms, using things like friend feed and whatnot to really draw all the conversations together. So I think that's something that can be taken from the political and applied to a corporate perspective, as well as seeing, does it make most sense to be able to be looking at just a smaller niche, or finding these broader platforms where you can play.
All right, thank you, Monty. I have actually one more question that I will ask, but then we'd like to open it up to the audience. Jill, can you please give the instructions for submitting a question?
Certainly. At this time, if you'd like to register to ask a question, please press the star and 1 on your touch-tone phone. You may withdraw your question at any time by pressing the pound key. Once again, to ask a question, please press the star and 1 on your touch-tone phone. We'll take our first question after Michael asks his next question. Thank you.
Steve, one thing that we like to talk a lot about is that big brands need to think like small brands, and one example that we use is Blendtec. Blendtec basically dramatically grew their business by using a variety of viral videos and YouTube videos to illustrate how their blenders work, and the brand really took off, and they've got like a cult following now. Can you talk a bit about the uphill battle that we've seen over the last few years, getting big brands to actually participate in social media, and possibly give some thoughts or advice on what are some easy first steps in order to begin to either take advantage of certain opportunities, to counter risks, or to just begin to get a real feel for what the opportunities are?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that in the beginning, when you and I first, Michael and I have been doing this for 5 years now, more 7 years, and I think in the beginning there was this giant fear factor. It was like, oh my God, people are talking about us, and what do we do? And I think that I've seen a lot of that fear evaporate. I think people recognize that this is here to stay, and they kind of have no choice in the matter, that this is something they have to pay attention to. And I think, so I've seen some acceptance around that. I think that the big stumbling block has been bandwidth. Is that, people really feel, people are amazed that this stuff just takes a lot of time and effort. I have one client that started up a blog, and this week or last week, and they wrote about how much work it is to really have a blog. It's a lot of work. Or to follow what people are saying about you on Twitter or these different social networks, especially as it expands. It's a high bandwidth role. And so I think that companies have struggled to get either to have people who they have kind of put out there as their ambassador to represent them as they begin to dabble in this space. So I think that one of the things you could do is to pick a topic that's high interest to the community, and pick somebody who is already predisposed to participating in these different types of social networks, who is on your staff, and then give them some license to run with that and to see what happens. I think Zappos has done an amazing job of taking their customer service reps and putting them out there and letting them engage with the Twitter audience. That's a very focused effort. And so I think you start small and then you see where it could go, but you need somebody who's going to be freed up to both from a resource perspective and empowered to engage.
All right, thank you, Steve. With that, we'll take our first question. I think we're going to probably run a few minutes over for those of you who would like to stick around. Go ahead, Jill.
Our first question comes from the side of Ewan Pernar with Bards. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. My question to the panel would be, in a country or a continent like Africa that is not very technology savvy, it's technology rich, how can you convince companies about the merits of having a social media and social network campaign when a lot of them still need to convert to the online world?
John Kerr, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. I think Africa is a particular challenge. I talked about the 2,200 languages in Asia, and I think Africa has around 2,000 itself. But if I think about a market like Vietnam, which has a very low internet penetration, but that internet penetration is to a very, very influential audience. If you look at the way that brands are marketing in Vietnam today, for example, Unilever, they're using very traditional marketing approaches, but building a layer of social media on top that is consistent with the overall campaign. So I think really what I would say is that, in emerging markets where marketers are seeing results from traditional methods, that there's a certain, risk aversion in terms of, experiment and play with social media. It's really about not necessarily social media being a strategic pillar of the campaign or necessarily leading the campaign as it is in many of the other sophisticated markets, but really looking to try and build another layer on top of the overall marketing program. I think that helps with measurement as well, which in emerging markets is one of the biggest challenges we have. So that would be my point of view.
Marshall, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just one thought, which is that we've actually had a number of clients ask us about, are there opportunities to do social media in Africa and other developing markets, and the answer is, no, not in the traditional sense. I think John makes a great point that you can reach influencers. But the other thing that I think is clear and that clients need to keep in mind is that we're all carrying around mobile devices, and nowhere is mobile penetration greater, and I would argue more significant as a communications matter than it is in some of those developing markets. And even in the developing markets, a lot of those mobile devices have web connectivity, MMS capability, capabilities far beyond what even a basic PC had 8 or 9 years ago. So I think we need to think carefully about, in those emerging markets, how can we employ mobile to communicate with our target audiences and have conversations with them and get conversations going among them as well.